Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds.
Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month.
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
The humid Georgia air was heavy in the city of Duluth on September 12, 2023. Blue and red lights flickered across the front of a Korean sauna. At 10:50 p.m., officers arrived to the parking lot of Jeju Sauna, a Korean bathhouse located at 3555 Gwinnett Place Drive. The call had come in less than a half hour earlier from a man named Emmanuel Rosado, who stood visibly shaken by what he had seen. Mr. Rosado was the father of Eric Hyun, a name officers would come to know well in the hours ahead. Mr. Rosado explains that earlier that morning around 9 a.m., his son had reached out to him pleading for help. Eric had been injured, badly, and couldn't even stand or walk without excruciating pain. He drove his son to the hospital, unsure of what had happened to him. It took more than 20 minutes just to get him up out of the car and into the emergency room. But the police were not here for Eric's well-being. It was in the hours following the hospital visit that led Mr. Rosado back to the car. His wife had urged him to go back to their son's car to retrieve all of his personal belongings. See, they were worried about the risk of a smash and grab. He had left behind some valuable items like a laptop. As he moved through the car, collecting the laptop and various items, he opened the trunk and found a thick, pink blanket balled up. Then the smell hit him, and he knew what he had just found: a body. The victim was an unidentified woman, her frame small, withered away just to 70 pounds, or 32 kilograms. She was an adult, but that was all they could tell at the scene. Her remains had already begun to decompose. She'd been in the trunk of the car for at least a few days, in the hot, humid Georgia summer. The rest of her identity and the connection to Eric Hyun remained unknown. Welcome to Korean True Crime with me, your host, Mimi Mizuko. Thank you to my patrons for making this show possible. If you would also like to support the show, you can find us on Patreon. You can also find merch like hoodies. Following the show wherever you listen helps a lot. I appreciate feedback and reviews as well. Lastly, you can join us on Discord for movie nights and just hanging out. Links should be in the description. Warning: today's episode will contain discussions about religious abuse. Listener discretion is advised. Eric's father, Mr. Rosado, hadn't spoken to his son in quite some time. He couldn't offer much insight into his son's life. The two had not been close in recent years, but they still had small talk every once in a while when Eric remembered to call. He told the police that he knew his son had purchased a home recently in the Sewanee suburb outside of Atlanta, but he wasn't sure what the exact address was. 2 detectives came to speak to Mr. Rosado that evening: Detective Angela Carter and Detective Randy Blackburn of the Homicide Unit. Detective Carter made the decision not to move the victim's body from the car until it was at the medical examiner's, because they needed to await a warrant to search the rest of the vehicle. Mr. Rosado didn't technically own the car, and therefore couldn't give permission for them to obtain evidence from the rest of the vehicle. They didn't want to risk losing any evidence that was in the car. When Detective Blackburn first met Eric Hyun, it wasn't in an interrogation room or at the crime scene. It was in the burn unit of the hospital. Eric had sustained severe injuries. He had circular puncture wounds and large irritated burns covering a majority of his body. Eric claimed that these injuries were the result of a basement explosion at his home, which he described as an accident involving a paint can that he had filled with pellets and other materials, an unfortunate event from his experimenting with building things in his basement. Detective Blackburn documented Eric's injuries with photographs, but refrained from a misstep that would have identified that Eric's wounds were not conclusive of an explosion. Despite him being admitted to the burn ward, he didn't actually have any burns on his body. Rather, he had severe abrasions and pellet gunshot wounds from a BB gun. Eric's story was full of unsettling details. He claimed that his friend Jace had helped him clean and dress his wounds, and that the explosion had occurred in the basement of his friend's family's home. His wounds were clean, and they were no longer bleeding, but infection was a serious concern, so he was admitted to the hospital for a few days. He would later be transferred to an infirmary within a state penitentiary. He was detained already because he admitted to having knowledge of the deceased in his vehicle. When detectives began questioning Eric about the body in his car, his story was all over the place. First, he identified the woman as 33-year-old Korean tourist Cho Se-hee, but he spoke about her as if she were still alive, suggesting that she climbed into the trunk by herself because the car was too full. He claimed that she was feeling unwell and he was taking her to get help. But the story didn't hold up. The car was not cluttered in any means, and her suitcase was sitting in the back seat, filled with all of her belongings that she had brought to America with her, including her Korean ID and Korean passport. Even though he identified the woman in the trunk, they still needed confirmation that the woman and the ID were the same person. So fingerprints were taken at the medical examiner's office and sent to the Korean consulate to await identification. It didn't take long until the Korean authorities confirmed that the deceased woman was indeed Se-hee Cho, who he was talking about. Eric's story about Se-hee entering the trunk on her own really didn't match what they found. She was swaddled in a thick blanket, and when Eric's father opened the trunk for them, they were hit with the unmistakable stench of decomposition. Se-hee had been dead for days, and they believe she was placed in that trunk. The Korean consulate confirmed it was Se-hee Cho, 33-year-old South Korean national who had just arrived in the United States 2 months prior, in late July 2024. Se-hee had been brought to Georgia by her mother under the guise of spiritual healing by joining a Korean Pentecostal church. But instead of finding healing offered by the church, she was recruited to join the Soldiers of Christ, a religious organization Eric had belonged to. Detective Carter played a pivotal role in piecing together Se-hee's story, and she would be the one who later testified at the criminal trial regarding the police's findings. Her testimony is a major source for today's episode. Eric Hyun, who is 26 at this time, was continuing to change his story regarding how Se-hee ended up in the trunk of his car. However, each time he was insistent that she got into the trunk on her own accord. First, he told them that he was taking her to the doctor to help her feel better, but his car was too full, so she had nowhere to sit, so Se-hee said that she would sit in the trunk. But then he started to say that he actually had taken her from their home to escape. But escape from what? As Detectives Carter and Blackburn remained with Eric, they dispatched Sergeant Poppy and Detective Araya to the address Eric's car was registered to, which was a suburban home at 2415 Stablegate, Lawrenceville, Georgia. The Stablegate residence was home to 54-year-old Mi-hee Lee, her husband, Mr. Lee, her sons, 22-year-old Junhyun Isaac Lee, and 26-year-old Junho David Lee. These boys went by their English middle names, so I will refer to them by Isaac and David. Staying at their house was also Kawan Lee, their 26-year-old cousin from Korea, and their 15-year-old little brother, who will not be named in this case, so we will just refer to him as the juvenile or the little brother. At this time, Hyunji Esther Lee, David's fiancée, was also at the home. If their names are getting confused for you, don't worry, I will reference their relation to one another often. As the detectives approached the home, they saw the 15-year-old little brother in the driveway dragging the trash out to the curb because the garbage collectors were making their rounds throughout the neighborhood. The detectives stopped him and asked him to actually return inside the home because they needed to speak to his parents. The same unmistakable stench was emanating from the garbage can. The same smell from the trunk. A smell any seasoned homicide detective could identify. The smell of decay. Inside the trash can was one large cardboard box that appeared to have blood stains on the outside. Crime scene investigators were called in and a field test was conducted on the box, which revealed the presence of human blood. The home was now confirmed as the crime scene. Inside the cardboard box, they found evidence of what happened to both Eric and Sehi. Sandpaper blocks stained with blood, tissues used to clean up various bodily fluids, duct tape with strands of hair stuck to it, a pair of filthy pajama bottoms stained with both blood and human waste, everything emitting a strong, foul odor of decay. The pajamas were also the same pattern as the top that Sehi's body was found wearing, the second piece of a matching set. And at the bottom of the cardboard box were dozens of white BB pellets, identical to those from Eric's story. Meanwhile, Detectives Carter and Blackburn made their way to the home Eric had recently purchased, which was located in Suwanee, Georgia. This home was newer, and having obtained a search warrant, they took a look inside. They were looking for evidence to substantiate the claims that there was an explosion in the basement. Problem was, this home did not have a basement. The home itself was empty, as if he had just purchased it. Inside, they found a mattress on the floor, some clothes in the closet, and very minimal signs of occupancy. It didn't look like anyone was truly living in this space. With this home being a dead end, they made their way to the Stablegate residence to join the other detectives in questioning the 7 occupants. When Sergeant Poppy and Detective Araya spoke to Mihi, the owner, they asked to speak to Jace, whom Eric said had helped him clean his wounds. But no one there was named Jace. David came forward and said his online gamer tag did include the word Jace, but when they called to ask Eric if David is who he was actually referring to, even so much as sending a picture over to show, is this the David you're talking about, he suddenly backtracked and said, no, I'm talking about someone else, that's not him. The police suspected that this indeed was the man that he was talking about, but it seemed he had a reason to lie. Interviews were conducted at the home, but all of the individuals were eventually taken to the police station for further questioning, except for the mother and father, who appeared at the time to not be involved. Mihi would later be brought in for an interview, but the father would never play a role in this case. There's very little information about him or his knowledge of what was truly happening within his home. The police learned bits and pieces from each of their interviews. Mihi Lee provided critical context. She explained that Eric Hyun had been living with her and her family and attended their church, to which Mr. Lee was a pastor at. He had been staying with them for an extended period of time until he was going to move into his own home that he purchased. The police showed a picture of Sehi's ID, which was found in a suitcase in the backseat of Eric's sedan. They asked her, "Do you recognize this woman?" Mihi said, "Yes, that's Sehi, the daughter of my friend, Mrs. Park, who had come to visit from South Korea on a spiritual retreat at my church." Mrs. Park and Sehi had been staying with them, but she says they both left the days prior to return to South Korea. They haven't seen them since. The police had noticed then, walking around the Lee family home, that there were multiple garments of clothing bearing the acronym SOC, which stood for Soldiers of Christ. They asked her about this organization and if it was related to the Korean Pentecostal church that her husband was a pastor at. And she told them, no, This is a small religious group to which we all belong. Mihi and her family had migrated to America to open their church. She said that God told them to move to America. She and her husband had always been very deeply religious, and it said that she would often pray for hours on end, once praying for 15 straight hours. They were very dedicated to their religion. And that was the reason Sehi came to Georgia. She came for the promise of spiritual healing. But from the statements given by their 15-year-old son, the Soldiers of Christ recruitment process was far from holy. The juvenile described the process as grueling and relentless. It tested your faith and your endurance. Recruits were required to complete daily tasks, attend meetings, and face punishments if they failed to comply. From the moment recruits began the process, they were not able to quit. There was no way to stop. You weren't allowed to. According to the boy, Sehi did not like this process. In fact, she said she wanted to leave immediately after hearing the orientation speech. She realized that their promises of healing and salvation and relaxation were all lies. The boy's honesty would lead the police to scrutinize every single thing that the family told them. The detectives continued to search the home, looking for the mentioned basement. They found the entrance to the basement, which is a combined garage and storage area. The walls are unfinished wood with concrete floors. As soon as they opened the basement door and took a few steps down, a smell stung their noses so strong they could barely breathe. Bleach and Febreze mixed in the air and made it difficult to breathe. They requested the back door and garage door be propped open to air out the smells. As they continued to walk through the garage area, bombarded by the smell still, there was a loud Korean Christian worship music playing throughout the home. In fact, it was actually just one song on repeat constantly. Just observing the area, they found large blood droplets on the floor near a corner used for storage. The only thing in that corner was a single chair. The floor was still wet with bleach that they had tried to clean away the blood. Mihi swore up and down that they had been cleaning to remove mold from the concrete because of the humidity. But not even bleach and Febreze could mask the disgusting smell of a decomposing human body. They moved closer to the storage area, noticing small bullet-like holes in the wall, likely due to the BB gun pellets that they found in the trash. That's when it all made sense. The puncture wounds on Eric's body weren't from an explosion. He was shot with a BB gun repeatedly. And the bloody sandpaper blocks? They could have been the ones used to rip the skin off of his chest, arms, and back. Could Eric be another victim in this case? The detectives continued their search of the home. There were multiple firearms found in the home, as well as the BB gun likely used on Eric. It appeared as if they were hoarding weapons. With the odd religious activity, firearms, religious symbols on the clothing, a dead body, and a potential second victim, they were concerned about the group's potential militancy and cult behavior. There could be a lot more victims. The police decided to detain everyone in the home and take them into the station for questioning. David, the eldest son's account was riddled with inconsistencies, just like Eric. He insisted that he said goodbye to Sehi and watched her leave with her mother for the airport in Eric's car. He denied any knowledge of an explosion or that he helped Eric clean wounds. David's voice got low as he talked to the officers. He said, Eric hasn't been doing well lately. He's been really unstable and he lies a lot. Despite his attempts to make Eric appear even more untrustworthy, the police continued to press him about the decomposing smell in the basement, the bleach, and the blood found in the trash. Slowly over time, he began to open up. He admitted that they prevented Sehi from leaving because if she had left, she would have tried to, quote, assassinate them. Whatever this meant, murder them or ruin their reputation is unclear. It's just doubtful that a 70-pound frail woman would have posed a threat to anyone in the home. In the meantime, the police obtained access to each of their phones. Primarily, everyone involved communicated in Korean, so there was a wait to translate the texts and messages they had sent to one another. However, they did have a Korean officer who was able to assist them initially. On multiple of their devices were photos and videos taken within the past few weeks of Se-hee. The majority of these were found on Eric's phone. The photos and videos showed Se-hee in early August as a healthy woman smiling. Then, they watched the dates on the photos progress, showing her deteriorate into a fragile husk of who she was just weeks prior. It was pieced together from some of the messages by the Korean officer that Eric was the newest member of the Soldiers of Christ, and he was actually in the final parts of his own recruitment process. He was charged with taking care of Se-hee and recruiting her into the group. While it was previously thought that Mi-hee, the mother of the home, would have been the leader of the Soldiers of Christ, this wasn't the case. Rather, David, the eldest son, was the leader. He claimed that Soldiers of Christ was an international organization, yet investigators found no evidence that this group existed beyond the confines of their suburban home. Each of the group members, Mi-hee, David, Isaac, Hyunji, Kawan, and the 15-year-old little brother, all messaged orders and tasks to Eric involving Se-hee. The first order from David was for Eric to pick up Se-hee and her mother from the airport. Except David, actually none of them, ever referred to Se-hee by her name in these messages. They only ever referred to her as number 5. It was suggested that Eric was also referred to by the number 4, but this is not mentioned in the actual trial, only by Eric's lawyer in an interview, so I cannot confirm the validity of that claim. Throughout all of the messages and videos, Se-hee is only ever called number 5. If she is number 5 and Eric is possibly number 4, then who are the other 3? Potentially Isaac, Hyunji, and Kawan? It's unclear if there were other victims who joined and failed, or if this is referring to initiated members. The police are still working to discover this very answer. The group also used cryptic or secretive language when discussing their crimes. They were careful when texting each other, but not careful enough. They never specifically said what was going to happen to Se-hee. It was always a task or assignment or initiation. Without the photos and video evidence that the police collected, we might not know what happened to Se-hee at all. In the first text regarding Se-hee's tasks and assignments, Mi-hee messages Eric telling him to instruct Se-hee that she is to immediately begin a long fast, meaning she is going to abstain from eating for a long period of time, perhaps weeks. Mi-hee also tells him that he needs to limit the amount of water that she's intaking. Se-hee is allowed to use the bathroom twice a day, and that's the only time she is allowed out of the basement. It's likely that being told that she was going to begin this fast was the first red flag, and that's when she showed disinterest in joining the group. But like the 15-year-old brother said, no one is allowed to leave once the initiation has begun. David and Mi-hee would continue to message Eric telling him when he needed to be in the basement to make sure that Se-hee was quiet. So anyone visiting the home, like her and her husband's congregants, contractors, or anyone else, wouldn't hear Se-hee. Eric was also told to sleep in the basement at night with Se-hee, which meant that the mattress down there was likely his, and Se-hee was sleeping on the hard concrete floor. No one who visited the home suspected what they were doing. A few of the family's church members had been to the house during this time and said that nothing seemed out of the ordinary. They had no idea. But neighbors said that the family acted a little bit strangely. Like one time, a neighbor came out to take his trash out at night. When he saw 5 of them standing in the middle of the road, holding hands in a circle, praying with their heads down. When they heard him coming out, they all looked at him and then quietly went back inside. They didn't say anything. other than the weird prayer, the neighbors shrugs it off as just weird church people. But while all of this was happening, Sehi was held captive in the basement. Based off of her autopsy, she didn't have any restraint marks or signs that she was being tied down. Despite this, she was monitored all of the time and unable to escape. The first video that was discovered on Eric's phone showed Sehi bending forward, holding up her body with her head on the ground. Her arms were bound behind her back as an unseen person off camera whipped her with a belt repeatedly. Sehi already appeared to have lost quite a bit of weight and was shaking from what was called a punishment. Eric's lawyer would detail that he also was subjected to this punishment as part of the initiation process. In his instance, he stated that Isaac was required to beat him with a belt in his genitals and face until he was unconscious. He states that these punishments were done as a way to test his faithfulness to God. The next uncovered video showed Sehi extremely malnourished and weak, being told to keep going as she performed jumping jacks with legs that were shaking beneath her. Likely, another punishment she was given. The most common punishment she was given was getting into a tub of ice. The first time she is seen getting into an ice bath, they had filled a large cooler of ice and water. She sits in the tub of ice water and endures the discomfort. Then days later, they had made an even larger tub they'd provided and filled it with ice and water once again. She is made to get into the water. In many of these videos, Eric, Isaac, or David don't speak to her, but in this video, they do. They shout at her, get in all the way." In this video, she appears weak, shaking as she even steps into the tub. And as time goes on, with her in the freezing water, she struggles to keep her eyes open. She looks as if she's going to fall asleep, and her breathing is frantic and her shivering is out of control. This video is what the police first believe might have been her cause of death because of how horrific she looked in the video. Her breathing and weakness, lack of food and water, combined with hypothermia, would lead to a cardiac arrest. But the date on the video and photos showed that she survived a few days longer. It was surprising someone so malnourished and frail could have survived even another hour. The final photo of Sehi showed her in the storage area. At first, it looks like she's sleeping, but upon further inspection, the detectives identified that she is indeed deceased in this photo. Her hands and feet are showing signs of decomposition as they've changed from the pale yellowing of a recently deceased person to gray, purple, and black. Sehi is wearing the pajamas, including the matching pajama bottoms that were found in the trash. This photograph was dated August 28, 2024, 15 days prior to the discovery of the body in Eric's car. At this point, she had already begun decomposition, meaning she had died even before this photo was taken. The 7 Soldiers of Christ members were confronted with the evidence that had been collected, and ultimately, they all confessed to participating in or witnessing these acts. In a few of the videos, Isaac, Eric, and David are seen visibly as they whip her, push her head under the ice water, or yell at her. All of this is happening in the basement of the Stablegate home, which I've provided a link to photographs of the home on a Realty website. You can find this on my Patreon, where I post all of my used sources for free. The photographs are taken prior to the E family moving in. I believe that this home is not up for sale since, so these are old photos. It's a very interesting layout of a home, with a basement garage and a children's room painted with rainbows. I think the innocence of the home's appearance is what gives me chills. That a family that led a church, had potlucks and prayer services, had been holding a woman captive to torture her in their basement. Within the basement, there were small garage door windows, which the police noted had been pasted over with newspaper so no sunlight could be seen in the basement. Despite there being no padlocks on any of the doors, Sehi was being held prisoner in this home. In the basement, Eric was in charge of caring for Sehi. He did occasionally attempt to help her following her punishments, as we can see through his text messages. At one point, she had fallen ill with a fever, and he had gone out to find medicine for her. When he returned, Sehi was unable to take the medicine due to severe dehydration. She had difficulty swallowing because her throat was so dry. Eric messaged Mihi asking what should I do. Water was allowed in this instance to be given to her. But one kindness does not excuse all of the evil that was done. A lot more of the information was gathered from the conversations between David and his fiancée Hyunji. Hyunji was fully aware of what was taking place in the home, but she wasn't present for most of it. Oftentimes, she learned about what was happening from David. The two used both KakaoTalk, a Korean messaging app, and Telegram, an app that has become synonymous with criminal proceedings to me because of how often I reference it in these cases. Through their discussions, we learned that when Sehi arrived, David, who, reminder, is the founder of Soldiers of Christ, that Sehi was possessed by an evil spirit or a demon. He referred to her as evil and demonic. They needed to work hard together to ensure her salvation in the eyes of their God. David had previously made claims of being able to see and sense evil spirits at his father's church. He had taken an active role at his father's church and even spoken and given his own sermons. Hyunji didn't take a passive role in this imprisonment either. She was the one who told David to take Sehi's phone as soon as she arrived at their house. She even detailed how long the fasts should have lasted. According to her messages, Sehi began to faint often from lack of food and water. Despite this, Sehi wasn't given any food. A few days after her arrival, David references an incident in which Sehi escaped from the basement away from Eric and made it all the way upstairs to talk to the father, Mr. Lee. She was wearing nothing but her underwear at this time and was shouting. She pleaded with Mr. Lee to let her leave, but Mr. Lee, either unaware of what was happening or complicit, escorted her back to Eric. She had been without food for days at this point and was weak. As this piece of evidence was revealed in court, I find it really strange that the father wasn't named as an accomplice in this crime. But with most of the evidence solely being videos, photos, and text messages, he doesn't appear in any of these. It is probable that he had no idea what was happening. There's very little evidence regarding the father, and there's no victim to testify. At one point, David tells Hyunji that Sehi somehow contacted a man in Korea named Mr. Park. Still in the trial, they don't know who Mr. Park is or how she was able to contact him. As soon as Sehi arrived, Mihi confiscated her phone and her belongings. She didn't have any method of communication outside of the home. But David told Hyunji that he had caught Sehi trying to contact this Mr. Park and told him to call the police. But she was unsuccessful in sending the message apparently because he reassured Hyunji that it was taken care of. Hyunji would later in the trial try to insinuate that she was also treated badly when she underwent her own recruitment. But nothing nearly as bad as what Eric and Sehi endured. As well, she was complicit in many of the punishments and beatings that both Eric and Sehi received. His messages to Hyunji also revealed that Sehi and Eric were not their only recruits. They had been working to recruit a Korean-American woman who was attending Georgia State University. David had gone to meet her a few times even to discuss Soldiers of Christ, and she had plans to visit their church. Not the church in their basement, and not Mihi's church, but the church that they forced Eric into buying, the home in the Swanee suburb. As part of Eric's initiation, he had to forfeit all of his money. He gave all of his cards to Soldiers of Christ, aka David. David used Eric's credit cards to go shopping for himself. He took Hyunji and his parents to fancy restaurants, they went clothes shopping, and then he made Eric pay it off. Prior to Sehi's arrival, Eric was tasked with wiring $5,000 to the E family bank account. According to Eric, he never wanted to get that house, but they told him to, so he did. Isaac and the 15-year-old boy were both involved in the Soldiers of Christ recruitment as well, but they weren't as active in the messaging. Based on communications, Isaac was the second in command. He was the strongest, so he was often seen in the videos dealing the punishments. He occasionally gave orders to Kawan, the cousin that came from Korea, or to Eric. Kawan was also seen pushing Sehi's head under the ice water and shouting at her. He also dealt out some of the beatings, but for the most part, Kawan isn't referenced often. As far as Mihi and her husband, Mr. Lee, are involved, Mihi has been arrested for false imprisonment, but there's no evidence that she participated in beatings or tasks. She was not present in any of the videos, but admitted to holding Sehi captive in her own home. Mr. Lee has not been detained or arrested and isn't implicated in the trial. There's no evidence of his involvement, although this was surprising to me. Although this could change if any of the boys change their testimonies. He hasn't spoken much to the media, but he did state that on September 11th, it was David's birthday, so everyone got together to eat dinner at their house. This is the day prior to the discovery of the body. His father is in denial that any of this happened because if there was a body in the basement or they had just bleached the whole place, surely he would have smelled it, and he didn't smell anything wrong in the house. He was often at work, so he had no idea what was going on. That was his alibi. A month earlier, on August 17th, 2024, or 27 days after Sehi's arrival, Isaac messages David to tell him that Sehi is moaning and crying for food. She's pleading for someone to give her something to eat because she's so hungry at this point. Isaac asks if he's allowed to give any food to her, but David responds that if she continues to be noisy and cry, that Isaac should beat her, and that no, she's not allowed any food. So let's piece together what was Sehi's journey. Sehi had arrived in America on July 21st, 2024. David had kept detailed messages to himself detailing Sehi's fasting schedule, punishment tasks, as well as what Eric's were. The final message he sent to himself read, 1 a.m., time of death. This message was sent on August 18th, 2024. Not even 24 hours after Isaac messaged David about Sehi crying because she was so hungry, meaning that Sehi was held captive in the Soldiers of Christ home for 28 days before she succumbed to her torture. Her exact time of death cannot be determined based on this memo he saved. But the medical examiner concludes that she did indeed pass sometime in mid-August, and this likely is the correct time of death. However, in criminal cases, everything must be scrutinized and proved with evidence. So there is no official time of death. Her cause of death is also not officially declared because there are so many contributing factors. Stress, malnourishment, dehydration, hypothermia, and physical trauma all contributed to her death. She didn't have any signs of restraints on her ankles or feet, and there was no signs of her being locked in the basement as far as being physically restrained. However, this doesn't mean she wasn't held there under the threat of punishment or violence. A main point brought up by the defense attorneys was that Sehi willingly joined the church. She came to America knowing she was joining their church, but there's no evidence to suggest that she knew the abuse that she would endure through the recruitment process. As for her cries for help from multiple of the captors, this shows that she had rescinded any consent she had given. As the detectives pieced together what happened, they were finally able to contact Sehi's mother, Mrs. Park, who had returned to South Korea just a few days after her and Sehi arrived. But why did she return without Sehi? Well, Mrs. Park told the detectives that she had known Mihi through church connections, and they had been talking recently about her troubles. Sehi had, in previous months, been sexually assaulted in South Korea. Following this violent attack, which resulted in no justice, she fell into a deep depression and had expressed suicidal thoughts. Her mother cared a lot about her and was very religious, so she asked Mihi for advice. Mihi was insistent that the two of them come to Georgia, visit the church, and they would offer Sehi a spiritual reawakening retreat. They would host Sehi at their house and care for her, give her a new beginning. Prior to leaving Korea, Sehi had visited a doctor for a normal checkup, and she was perfectly healthy. She was in the healthy weight range with no medical complaints. I say this because of how drastic her weight loss was and how drastic her health deteriorated over the next 28 days of her life. Mihi didn't really need to convince Mrs. Park too much because for many Koreans and other migrant communities, religion is a very large part of their lives, so it was welcoming to have that waiting for them in Georgia. Religion often brings people of similar cultures together to bond, even when you're living abroad. Sehi's mother had to return to Korea, but would bring her daughter to Georgia. It wasn't hospitality awaiting them, though. They were being preyed upon. Sehi was the vulnerable person that a cult like Soldiers of Christ could smell miles away. A person who had lost a will to live, lost their purpose, so they knew they could manipulate her. Mrs. Park, to show her gratefulness, sent the church a few $1,000s to reimburse the cost of caring for Sehi, which is exactly what the church wanted. They were in this for money. Within that time, Mihi detailed that Sehi would have limited contact so she could focus on her spirituality, which her mother didn't think too much of. Mihi continued to keep in contact with Mrs. Park, but didn't tell her when her daughter passed away. Then she just cut off all contact and went dark. They made it seem like everything was all right. They likely didn't have a plan for what they would do after Sehi passed, so they just decided to cut off all contact with Mrs. Park. Following Sehi's passing, Mihi messaged Eric, reassuring him that this was not his fault and that he did everything he could do to help her. This message was proof that everyone involved had knowledge of Sehi's passing and that she was in need of medical attention but was not provided it. None of the involved have admitted in court to who put the body in the trunk. But later, with his ever-changing testimonies, Eric told his lawyer that he finally took Sehi's body, put it in his car, and tried to escape the Soldiers of Christ. He believed that he would die, just as Sehi had. He had received punishment for Sehi's passing. The skin missing from large patches on his body from the sandpaper blocks and BB pellet gunshot wounds all over his body were proof of this. He was instructed, take care of the body. So it's unclear if he took the body and ran, or if he was merely caught with the body in the process of disposing of it. But either way, he needed to stop for medical attention for himself, and that's when all of this happened. The trial for this case remains ongoing, with sentencing anticipated later in 2025. As updates become available, I will share them on my social media platforms, and if possible, I'll incorporate them into this episode through editing. This case shows that there is a large overlap between gang initiation and cult indoctrination, both of which are maintained through fear and violence. Because Soldiers of Christ is being referred to as a small-time gang in the media rather than a cult because they had such limited numbers. According to the National Domestic Violence Hotline, spiritual abuse frequently involves religious leaders creating toxic environments that manipulate and control the followers. They use their authority to instill guilt and shame. In an earlier episode, we covered the Odaeang cult's tragic murder-suicide. We've explored how charismatic leaders can drive followers to commit extremes. These figures often demand unwavering loyalty and reshape the identities of these individuals to prioritize the group's goals above all else. This dependency on the group fosters obedience, making it easier for members to justify harmful actions in the name of a higher purpose. Religious cults frequently thrive on promises of acceptance and certainty, discouraging any independent thought whatsoever. By isolating members from outside influence, it undermines their personal relationships, it isolates them, and it creates this guilt for pursuing personal needs. This is how cults create control. This constant manipulation normalizes dangerous behaviors, like putting yourself through these punishments and tasks in the name of proving your faithfulness. When this case became large, it stirred a lot of talk in the Korean community about cults in Korea. Gwinnett County, Georgia, is often referred to as the Seoul of the South. It's home to a significant Korean American community. They have a lot of Korean-owned businesses like restaurants, bakeries, and spas. This case didn't only spark discussion in the Georgian Korean community, but also in South Korea, about the country's growing issue with religious extremism. As we've previously noted, Korea's introduction to Catholicism and Protestantism was partly fueled by the pursuit of wealth. There's a belief that if someone couldn't succeed academically, they would become a faith leader, and that would lead them to wealth or fame. While this obviously doesn't represent all Korean institutions, there is a growing number of churches that are being criticized for their exploitative practices. Some of the largest churches in Korea have mandatory tithing, and religious leaders are often known to lead political protests in Korea that go against them making money. As these issues continue to gain attention, I may explore other cases involving predatory religious cults in future episodes. It's always a really interesting part of society for me, so if you want to hear more about cult-type crimes, please let me know. As always, thank you for listening. Join us on Discord for free movie nights. Find my sources on Patreon, Quarterly Sticker Club on Patreon. You can get a Korean True Crime hoodie on Patreon now. Follow the show wherever you listen from. And finally, thank you to my patrons, Vix Mac, Lala, William White, Jiwon Edwards, Nico, Elijah Hancock, Anomanom, Dr. Bob, Lumos, Emma Brown, David Defoya, Adriana, Pip, Dade512, Lisa, Veronica, Olive, Caitlin, Sharon Evans, Nicey, Breaker O'Day, Kitten Who, Ostabach, Quilt00, and Kristen. 다음에 또 봐요. See you next time.